In February 1983, a plumber who'd been called out to unblock a drain was shocked when he discovered that the drain was blocked with human bones and flesh. This discovery launched one of the biggest murder investigations in Metropolitan Police history. Perhaps even more shocking was that upon arrest, occupier of the top flat, 37-year-old Dennis Nilsen, confessed that not only had he killed the 3 young men whose remains would be found in his apartment, but that he had in fact murdered 12 to 13 more men over a period of 5 years. This is the portrait of Dennis Nilsen. Hi, I'm Lostloz, an artist from Wales in the UK. In the interest of levelling up my digital art skills, I decided to create a series of digital portraits of serial killers using Procreate. In each episode, I'll talk about the life and crimes of each of the serial killers while showing you the process of completing their portrait. So, if you love art and find serial killers intriguing, get comfy. Welcome to Portrait of a Serial Killer. Okay, before I start, I just want to give you guys a quick disclaimer. This episode is going to be pretty intense. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the following: murder, dismemberment, necrophilia, paedophilia, and homophobia. I'm not going to go into all of the gory details, but this could still be upsetting to some people. If that's you, that's fine. Keep yourself safe and click out the video. Maybe I'll see you in the next one. Okay, let's start. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, to parents Elizabeth White and Olaf Mocksham. Dennis's father was a Norwegian soldier who had travelled to Scotland in 1940 after Germany had conquered Norway during World War II. Olaf changed his name to Nilsen to better assimilate. The couple wed in 1942 and moved into Elizabeth's parents' home. They had 3 children over the next 6 years, first a boy named Olaf Jr., then they had Dennis, and finally a girl named Sylvia. Nilsen's father was neglectful of the family. By all accounts, he was rarely seen in the family home. This absence resulted in Nilsen's mum initiating a divorce, which was finalised in 1948. Nilsen's maternal grandparents would continue to play a huge hand in raising him and his siblings. Lacking a father as a role model, Nilsen grew particularly close to his grandfather, and although still young, Nilsen recalls fond memories of long walks with his grandfather placing him on his shoulders when his legs got tired. Nilsen's grandfather was a fisherman, which meant he would spend time away at sea. Nilsen described these times as being empty until his grandfather would return. In 1951, while out at sea, the grandfather had a heart attack and died. It was common practice at the time to have the body brought in its coffin to the home of the deceased before burial. Nilsen recalls his mother asking him if he wanted to see his grandfather. Nilsen, unaware of his grandfather's death, accepts and is brought to the living room where the body is. He was told that his grandfather was asleep and had gone to a better place. Nilsen had just turned 6 and couldn't understand why his grandfather hadn't taken him to this better place too. The family did not discuss the grandfather after this, and this left Nilsen wondering for months if his grandfather would wake up one day and come back. Dennis would later reflect upon this period in his childhood and tell autobiographer Brian Masters, "My troubles started there. It blighted my personality permanently. I spent all of my emotional life searching for my grandfather, and in my formative years, no one was there to take his place." Nilsen, an already shy and quiet boy, is said to have withdrawn further following the death of his grandfather. In the years that followed, his mother moved the family out of the grandparents' home, remarried, and had a further 4 children. Nilsen grew to resent what he saw as the unfair amount of attention his mother, grandmother, and stepfather displayed towards them. During early adolescence, Nilsen became aware of his attraction to boys. Initially, he is confused and ashamed about his sexuality. He kept it hidden from his family and what few friends he had. Nilsen claimed no sexual encounters during his adolescence, but acknowledged that by the age of 16, he had concluded that he was homosexual. At the age of 16, Nilsen feels restricted and wants to escape the quiet rural life of a small Scottish town and his family's poor working class lifestyle. So in 1961, he enlists in the army as a means of escape, but also to better himself. He became a cook, serving as a butcher in the army catering corps, honing his skills that he would later use to dispose of the bodies of his victims. During his time in the army, he kept his sexuality hidden well. He He had his first proper experience with alcohol and realised that it helped him be more outgoing and sociable. Nilsen served 11 years before leaving the army with the rank of corporal in 1972. He returned home for a few months, but following a heated argument with his family, which involved a dispute about gay rights and whether or not Nilsen was gay, Nilsen left for London and didn't speak to his family again. In December 1972, Nilsen moved to London and began training to join the Metropolitan Police. The training concluded in April 1973, and he was posted as a junior constable. Nilsen doesn't feel the same camaraderie he felt in the army. He keeps himself to himself and spends most evenings drinking on his own or frequenting gay bars and pubs. He has several sexual encounters with men during this time, but nothing that lasts. Nilsen leaves the police after a year. He would later say he left because of homophobia. He takes up a job as a civil servant at a job centre. Colleagues there would later describe him as a quiet, conscientious employee. He continued to work for the job centre until his arrest. In November 1975, Nilsen met a 20-year-old man called David Gallahan outside a pub. He is currently living in a hostel, so the two decide to move in together. They end up renting a ground floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue. Nilsen describes this time as happy and contented at first, but by 1977 the relationship had broken down, and Gallahan eventually moved out. Over the following 18 months, Nilsen would have several short-term relationships with men he met at bars and clubs, but none that lasted. Towards the end of 1978, Nilsen was living a solitary existence, consisting of going to work in the day and drinking alcohol on his own each night. On the 30th of December 1978, Nilsen has gone out drinking, determined not to spend another night on his own. He happens to come across a boy outside a pub who has been refused alcohol because he didn't have ID. Nilsen invites the boy home on the promise of alcohol. They get to the flat and drink until they pass out. In the morning, Nilsen wakes up and notices the boy is still asleep beside him on the bed. Nilsen doesn't want the boy to wake up and leave. It's at this moment he decides to kill the boy. He reaches for his necktie and strangles the boy until he is unconscious before drowning him in a bucket of water. He then washes the body in a bathtub and places him back on the bed. Nilsen finds the still porcelain-like corpse sexually arousing. After masturbating over the corpse, Nilsen falls asleep beside it. The following day, he hides the body under the floorboards, where it remains for 8 months. Eventually, Nilsen builds a bonfire in the backyard and burns the body. This boy is Nilsen's first victim, but he's currently the last victim the police have been able to identify. In 2006, Metropolitan Police's cold case team reviewed the Nilsen case, compared cases of missing boys and young men with vague descriptions Nilsen had originally provided. The officers brought a picture of one of the boys to Nilsen, who confirmed that the boy was his first kill. The boy was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. Unfortunately, Stephen's mother had died 4 years earlier, not knowing what had happened to her son. In October 1979, Nilsen met Andrew Ho, a student from Hong Kong, while drinking in a pub. Ho ends up going back with Nilsen on the promise of sex. Nilsen attempts to strangle him, but Ho manages to escape by jumping through the living room window. Ho ends up being taken to hospital and receiving around 100 stitches. Ho reported this incident to police. Police arrested and questioned Nilsen for 2 days. Nilsen tried to convince police that this was just a bondage play session gone wrong. Ho was 19 years old, which means he was under the age of consent for gay sex in England at the time. After Ho's parents find out, they convince Ho to drop the charges. A police officer tries to change Ho's mind, but the potential threat of legal consequences, up to 2 years in prison, and the shame the trial would bring his family, it's too much for Ho, and he drops the charges. December 1979, Nilsen encounters a Canadian tourist, Kenneth Ockenden, at a pub. The next day, he takes Ockenden sightseeing, and they end up drinking. The two end up back at Nilsen's apartment. Fearing that Ockenden will soon leave, Nilsen strangles Ockenden whilst he's listening to music with the headphone cord. Nilsen repeats the same process as before, washes the body, puts it in his bed, engages in sexual acts, falls asleep next to the corpse, and then stores the body under the floorboards. However, this time he would bring the body back out, dress it, place it on a chair, and has conversations with it, as if it's alive. Ockenden was not like Nilsen's other victims. he was not homeless, poor, or without friends and family. So when Ockerton didn't return to his hotel to collect his belongings or contact his family, the police and the media were informed. It's believed police failed to link this case to Nilsen because Ockerton's parents were insistent that their son had a girlfriend and was not gay, so they failed to follow any leads that associated him with gay men. 5 months after killing Ockerton, on May 13, 1980, Nilsen meets Martin Duffy, a homeless 16-year-old. Nilsen invites him back to his apartment so he has a place to sleep for the night. Nilsen strangles him, then drowns him, and then continues with his usual ritual. Only this time he places the body in a wardrobe. After 2 weeks, Nilsen puts the body under the floorboards with the body of Ockerton. Billy Sunderland, a 27-year-old sex worker, was the next victim, followed by 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow, who was said to have been an orphan with learning disabilities. Both were killed by strangulation. At this point, Nilsen was running out of places to put the bodies, and Barlow's body was placed under the sink. Nilsen claimed that he had around 6 bodies in his apartment at this point, and the smell and flies were becoming unmanageable. As a means of disposing of the bodies, Nilsen puts his chefing skills to use and begins to skillfully dissect the bodies so he can burn them on a bonfire out the back garden, bit by bit, over time. He would put bits of tire on the fire as well to hide the pungent smell. Neighbours are aware that he's lighting fires, sometimes for whole days at a time, but they think that he's only burning rubbish. The body parts that didn't burn would be buried near the fire pit. Police would later find thousands of small bone fragments in the garden from where Nilsen crushed the bones once the fire had burned the rest away. In 1981, Nilsen's landlord decides to renovate the apartment, and this forces Nilsen to move. Nilsen moves to 23 Cranley Gardens, Muswell Hill, an attic apartment with no back garden for him to set bonfires. Nilsen believes that flushing bits of the body down the toilet would cause them to sink far enough into the sewers that they would never be found. In the period between moving into this new apartment in 1981 and being arrested by the police in February 1983, Nilsen killed a further 3 victims. These victims were identified as Stephen Sinclair, a homeless drifter from Scotland, John Howlett, a sex worker with substance misuse issues, and Graham Allen, who also had issues with substance misuse. In addition to the murders, Nilsen also had made several failed attempts at murder. Some of these survivors would later testify against him in court. This brings us back to where we first started on the 8th of February 1983. The drain specialist had found human bones and flesh blocking the drains at 23 Cranley Gardens and called the police. The residents, including Nilsen, are aware of this discovery. In fact, the plumber would later tell reporters that Nilsen had remarked that the bones and flesh looked more like that of KFC chicken than human remains. Police officers respond to the call the following day and are informed by residents that they had seen Nilsen attempting to unblock the drain in the early hours of that morning. Unfortunately for Nilsen, there were further blockages in the pipes leading up to his property and more human remains were found, including skin from the neck area with visible ligature marks. Police waited at the property for Nilsen to return from work, which he did around 5:30 p.m. Nilsen was calm and allowed the 2 officers into his apartment. Straight away, the police are hit by the stench of decomposing bodies. At this point, the police officer tells Nilsen to stop messing about and tell him where the rest of the body is. Nilsen points to the wardrobe where 2 big black bin bags are found. Both are full of human remains. Nilsen is arrested and driven back to the police station. During the drive, one of the police officers asks if it's just 1 or 2 bodies, to which Nilsen calmly responded, 15 or 16. Police now have 48 hours to find enough evidence to keep Nilsen in custody. Nilsen is talking. If anything, Nilsen won't stop talking. He admits to the murders, but he's vague about who the victims are, where he met them, and how exactly he murdered them. Nilsen claims he can't remember all the specifics because he was drunk or he had blacked out. Police found 3 bodies in the apartment at Cranley Gardens and pressed Nilsen to tell them where the rest were. Nilsen tells them that what's left of the others would be found at a previous apartment at 195 Melrose Avenue. 6 police officers were dispatched to the property to dig up the weather-hardened ground in the back garden of the property. 1 police officer would later refer to the gardens as a graveyard. Nilsen's method of disposing of bodies, dissecting, burning and burying them, or boiling and flushing them down the toilet, meant that there were very few remains left of some of the bodies. This made it difficult, and in some cases impossible, for the police to identify the victims. Parts belonging to at least 11 different bodies were found at Nilsen's current and previous apartments. Unfortunately, only 6 of Nilsen's murder victims were identified in time for the trial. These were Malcolm Barlow, age 23, Martin Duffy, 16, John Howlett, 23, Kenneth Ockenden, age 23, Stephen Sinclair, 20, William Sutherland, 26. Graham Allen, aged 27, was identified shortly after, and Stephen Holmes, aged 14, was identified in 2006. After identifying the bodies, the police were faced with more difficulties. Firstly, it was extremely difficult to find survivors because of the victim type Nilsen selected. Nilsen targeted runaways, men who were destitute. Most were homeless with addiction issues, and some were gay. In one way or another, most of these men were on the fringes of society, rarely missed, difficult to track, and unlikely to go to the police. Unfortunately, on the occasions that survivors had gone to the police, they were often not believed. Their horrific experiences were deemed fictional or not important enough to investigate. Secondly, convincing survivors to testify in court or go on record was a massive ask. This was because the press had people convinced that all of Nilsen's victims were gay men. To put this into context, homosexuality had only been decriminalised in England, Wales and Southern Ireland in 1967, and it remained illegal in Scotland until 1980 and in Northern Ireland until 1982. There was still extreme homophobia in UK society and its institutions, police included, so coming forward would have been very scary, even more so if you were gay. In November 1981, 19-year-old language student Paul Hobbs met Nilsen at a bar and ended up spending the night at his flat. He awoke to Nilsen trying to strangle him. He fought him back and managed to escape. Hobbs didn't report the attack because he himself would risk being prosecuted, because in 1981, the age of consent for gay men was 21. Hobbs provides testimony on his experience of Nilsen in court. This meant that not only did he have to come out to his family and the whole world, but he had to discuss in intimate detail his one-night stand with Nilsen in a courtroom full of strangers. In 1982, Douglas Stewart, a barman who had met Nilsen in a well-known gay pub, ended up going back to Nilsen's apartment. At some point, he fell asleep. When he woke up, he realised that he'd been tied up and Nilsen was attempting to strangle him. Stewart, after some struggle, managed to escape. He informed the police, but they spoke to Nilsen. They accepted his story of the incident being a lover's tiff and dropped the case. Stewart, reflecting upon this incident, would later say, "As soon as the word homosexual was mentioned, the police lost interest." Stewart heard nothing from the police until Nilsen was arrested and they realised that Stewart was actually a victim. In 1982, 21-year-old Carl Stotter went to Nilsen's flat after meeting him in a gay bar. Nilsen had strangled him with the zip of the sleeping bag Stotter was in and then tried to drown him. Thinking he had killed Stotter, Nilsen started his ritual of bathing him and placing him on the bed. Nilsen had decided to stop to have a cigarette, and while he did this, he noticed his dog had started licking Stotter's face. At this point, Nilsen realised that he was still alive. Nilsen took care of Carl, who was badly injured from the attack and unsure of what had happened, for 2 days before letting him go. Stotter went to the police, but they didn't believe him and so did nothing. It was only later, when Nilsen discussed a victim who he had let go to the police, that they were able to make the connection. Stotter informed the police that Nilsen had warned him about not getting caught up in the zip of the sleeping bag. This was Nilsen's way of covering his back if something went wrong. This was used in court as evidence that Nilsen premeditated his murders and was fully aware of what he was doing at the time of his crimes. Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Nilsen was brought to trial in the Central Criminal Court known as the Old Bailey. He was expected to plead guilty to each of these offences. However, Nilsen pleaded not guilty to every single charge, claiming diminished responsibility due to insanity. If Nilsen was deemed insane, he would receive a lesser charge of manslaughter for each of the cases and would be sent to a secure mental health facility rather than a prison cell. The prosecution was now faced with the difficult job of proving Nilsen was of sound mind when he committed the crimes. It was here where the survivor's experience in the case became crucial. Carl Stotter's account became particularly important because it proved premeditation. Ironically, the same man whose story they had previously dismissed as untrue and unimportant was now the man whose story became the utmost important because it ensured murder over manslaughter convictions. After a 10-day trial, Dennis Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison. He remained behind bars until his death on May 12, 2018, after suffering a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, a very painful complication resulting from an emergency surgery he had had 2 days prior. Only 5 people attended his cremation, 3 of whom were police officers. No one from his family was present. Thanks for watching. If you got something out of this episode, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more episodes, make sure you click the subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. I don't know what you guys might think, but I found this case to be really upsetting and massively frustrating. We always like to think that as a society we learn from our mistakes, but down the line we'll see the same level of homophobia gets repeated in cases like Jeffrey Dahmer and Stephen Port. In both of those cases, gay men are attacked and killed, and the police either don't pay attention, don't investigate fully enough, or don't take the report seriously. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on this one. But that's it for now. I'll catch you in the next one.